Welcome, everyone. We are extremely pleased to have you join us here today as we release this comprehensive framework from the Ransomware Task Force that is fundamentally aimed at blunting the trajectory of the ransomware threat. My name is Philip Reiner. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Security and Technology. At IST, our mission is really to provide an agile 21st century reinvention of the think tank model. We're built to do research on challenging emerging security threats, but also to create trusted venues where those who are working at the edge of technological development can engage directly with national security policymakers and work together to derive solutions to really incredibly complex threats to businesses and to governments alike. Our core mission therein is what drove us to stand up this ransomware task force. In light of the wave of attacks that we saw washing over the healthcare industry last fall, really in the midst of what was already an ever worsening pandemic-induced public health crisis, as ransomware was hitting water treatment facilities, increasingly targeting local governments, and going after school systems, it was increasingly clear to us that ransomware has risen to the level of being a much broader societal challenge and a national security threat, not just a niche computer crime that impacts organizations. We were really struck by the conviction that with all of the resources that governments and companies around the world have to bring to bear on a problem like this, the talent, the leadership, the technical prowess, and the passion, how is it that this threat continues to metastasize? And why hasn't someone been able to pull together all of the right people to better direct resources and address this threat at a strategic level from the top down? So we reached out, we engaged our partners. We had inspiration from those who are already in the community working on this, who had the same concern. And we touched out into our network to those that we know really care deeply about stopping these malicious actors. We very quickly found partners in both the public and private sector who were very much convinced that this threat, which has really affected the lives of so many people, that it really did rise to that question, to that need for a greater level of coordinated, intentional, international focus. And that many of them that we had reached out to were actually willing to give their time, their energy, and their creative ideas to help put together this effort. So therein up front, it's really worth noting that the nature of this task force was broad and expansive, with over 60 organizations involved, public and private, small and large, including representatives of organizations that deal with really every element of the ransomware challenge: threat intelligence, incident response, large platforms and cloud providers, those who engage in the actual negotiations with the criminals, folks from the cryptocurrency ecosystem, security providers, cyber insurance, and end user organizations really of every size, including healthcare and local government. Our intent from the very beginning was to break down barriers and cross-level information between sectors, which helped drive creative thinking, a really robust and I think healthy debate, and I think helped us come to some unique solutions. I think it also helped every member of the task force to better understand the challenges faced by others in the ecosystem. For example, why is it that a small business, for instance, in Middle America, might not be able or be willing to accept a free cybersecurity solution that's offered to them? Where is it in the information distribution process that things break down and that toolkits that are actually quite specific and useful and are readily available don't get to the right people? And how is it that potentially we can pinpoint choke points in the crypto ecosystem where collective action might make more of a difference? So today, we're going to walk you through the top line recommendations that the task force was able to come up with. I'll note right up front, we didn't get to everything, but we feel that the framework that we're proposing today really could have a significant impact if it is adopted with speed. We're extremely pleased today to be joined by an absolutely amazing group of leaders that have helped us run this process, each of whom is going to share with you the various components of the proposed framework. But also very pleased to be joined today by one of America's foremost leaders on the cybersecurity front, the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, the Honorable Alejandro Mayorkas. Before we turn to the substantive discussion, I really wanted to just take a moment and stop and say a word of thanks. None of this would be possible if it weren't for everyone out there that is already working to defeat these malicious actors. And that includes folks both in the public and the private sector. And you know who you are. You work in and day out behind the scenes, and most everyday citizens will never even know that that's happening. Our work is really meant to support you and to build off of the work that you're already doing. So we wanted to say a word of thanks. I'll return to more words of gratitude at the end of the session here today, but for now, let's get into the actual substance of the recommendations, again, that are meant to dramatically shift the trajectory of this threat. The bottom line conclusion that the task force would like to present you with today, and that we'll discuss in more detail over the next 90 minutes, is that ransomware is no longer just an economic nuisance. It's no longer just a challenging cybersecurity threat. It has really evolved into a serious national security and public health and safety threat. And this is only going to continue to worsen, putting more lives and critical infrastructure at risk, unless in the immediate term, national governments and industry work together to execute a coordinated, resourced, top-down, relentless operational campaign to disrupt those ransomware actors and their business model, using all tools of national power. Just as important, this is an international challenge at its core, and it must be addressed accordingly to dry up the safe havens from which these malicious actors operate with almost near impunity. Finally, with the level of priority and focus and how it needs to be increased, so must the level of resources dedicated against this problem, both in government, but also in the private sector. And you'll see these top line themes throughout the recommended actions in our report and in our conversation here today. This cybercrime is really so pervasive that now it targets kids and teachers, critical infrastructure to include healthcare and financial services. It puts all of those things at risk, and it puts human lives on the line. The barriers to entry for this criminal enterprise are really incredibly low. And as a result, we've seen the scale of damage that this is having now in the billions of dollars, draining critical resources from communities, from governments, and from business. These stolen funds, just to compound the problem, are then funneled into broader criminal activity, whether it's to further research and development for more malicious malware, or to awful crimes really against vulnerable communities through things like human trafficking, and then even facilitating, as we've come to understand in the recent past, even facilitating the development, potentially the development of weapons of mass destruction. This means that the priority level really needs to be raised, and it needs to be raised immediately. Every member of the task force concurred that greater effort needs to be undertaken now to check the ever-increasing capabilities of these actors that seem to act with near impunity, and we need to better protect those that they intend to harm. This is a solvable problem. That does not mean that there's only one or two things that need to be done to solve this. There is no silver bullet. There's a theme you'll hear throughout the conversation today. What it requires is a full array of actions, and that's why we've put forward a comprehensive framework to get after this problem. Those actions need to be taken in tandem. That means we need clarity in purpose and intent, we need follow through, we need the resources, and we need greater levels of coordination. That means governments, and it means private industry, and it means the executive and legislative branches in every country. It means also, though, that the typical modes of problem solving, I've got this part, you take that part, that really needs to be shelved for the greater common good. The criminals and states that harbor them have figured out how to deftly manipulate our bureaucratic seams between federal capabilities, but also between public and private collaborative abilities. I would say, and it's very much worth noting though, just in recent weeks, even in months, we've seen how national governments and industry already have mechanisms and to an extent the ability to do this. With the Emotet takedown and a little further back with NetWalker, those examples point to how this is possible. But it remains too uncoordinated, it remains too ad hoc. It needs to be scaled, prioritized, and resourced. On that very note, we're exceedingly pleased today to help kick this event off and to welcome participation in this launch event from someone who cares very deeply about these issues, the Secretary of Homeland Security. Since starting in office on February 2nd, Secretary Mayorkas has publicly made very clear that ransomware is a national security threat. He's announced that the department will initiate a number of cybersecurity-focused sprints, the first of which is focused on ransomware. And this is the kind of leadership that we call for in the RTF recommendations, as is what we've seen launched just in the recent past at the Department of Justice. We were very pleased the Secretary was willing to share some prepared comments for us here for the event today. So let us hear what Secretary Mayorkas has to say.
Good afternoon. I am Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security. Congratulations, Philip, and congratulations to the entire Ransomware Task Force for releasing this important report today after coming together only 4 months ago to tackle one of the biggest challenges we face, ransomware. This report is an impressive accomplishment. Thank you for including us at DHS in the process early on. The department will work to implement many of your recommendations because one thing is clear: ransomware is a threat to our national security. Like most cyber attacks, ransomware exploits the weakest link. In recent months, ransomware attacks have hit hospitals in New York, Nebraska, Oregon, and Michigan, among multiple other states, during an unprecedented pandemic that has resulted in more than 570,000 deaths in the United States alone. Nearly 2,400 state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, healthcare facilities, and schools across our country were victims of ransomware in 2020, as your report notes. Ransomware has also infected police and sheriff's offices and local governments from Atlanta and Baltimore to Fisher County, Texas. It takes an average of 287 days for an organization to fully recover from a ransomware attack. Many organizations decide to pay ransom to resume their operations. Last year, victims paid an estimated $350 million in ransom, a 311% increase over the prior year, with the average payment exceeding $300,000. Victims of ransomware face an impossible choice: pay a ransom and fuel a criminal market, or refuse to pay and hope their computer systems are restored. Unfortunately, many choose to pay, despite not always having their data or systems returned to them. More must be done to fight ransomware, to hold those accountable who perpetrate these attacks, and to mitigate threats to our national security. In March, I issued a call for action to more effectively combat ransomware, and the department kicked off its first 60-day sprint to tackle this problem. We formed a department-wide task force with experts from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA as it is commonly known, the Secret Service, Coast Guard, and ICE's Homeland Security investigations. The goal of this sprint is to ensure CISA's Reduce the Risk of Ransomware campaign reaches every corner of our country. There are basic cybersecurity steps every organization can take to protect against ransomware. Our awareness campaign is designed to increase adoption of the 9 steps CISA recommends taking to protect against this threat. We also encourage organizations to reach out to law enforcement as soon as they realize they may have been subject to an attack. Law enforcement agencies, namely the Secret Service and the FBI, play a critical role in identifying attackers and holding them accountable. Tackling this challenge requires partnerships across every level of government and the private sector. I have said before that the Department of Homeland Security is fundamentally a department of partnerships. In tackling the enormous challenges presented by ransomware, our partnerships are key to our collective success. To have a long-term impact, we need a whole-of-government approach paired with domestic and international partnerships. Attackers work across borders, and any effective response requires international cooperation. That is why earlier this month, I issued a ministerial statement regarding the threat of ransomware, together with my counterparts in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, highlighting that we need an international coalition to address this problem effectively. Beyond CISA, the government's principal interlocutor with the private sector on cybersecurity, the entire federal government is stepping up to face this challenge. Last week, the Department of Justice created its own internal ransomware task force, and the White House is developing a plan dedicated to tackling this problem. As the number of ransomware attacks continues to rise, the threat to our national security and to Americans' daily lives only grows. Cybersecurity is not an abstract concept, but something we all need to prioritize and invest in, whether you're a major hospital system or a small business. Thankfully, the task force's report provides a vision for what we can do to better address this urgent problem. DHS looks forward to working closely with the task force to turn its recommendations into action. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, for that vote of confidence in the substance of these recommendations, but also for your continued leadership and commitment to helping solve these issues for the nation and really for the international community. So what we're going to do now is we're going to begin our discussion here today on the substance of the task force's report by turning to two of the leading co-chairs of some of the working groups that were part of the overall effort. First, retired U.S. Army Major General John Davis, who joined the task force from the beginning on behalf of Palo Alto Networks, where he is the Vice President of Public Sector, and to Megan Stiefel, who was one of the very first people involved in this conversation and who joined the effort from the very beginning, and who joined on behalf of the Global Cyber Alliance, where she is the Executive Director for the Americas. John and Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Philip, and hello, everyone. First, let me say how proud I am to be a part of the Ransomware Task Force and to endorse this report. It's been an honor to serve alongside the other co-chairs, and I'm humbled by the level of expertise and passion that not only they, but the entire list of the many task force participants brought to this effort. With a group as diverse as this task force enjoyed, it'll come as no surprise that many different perspectives were represented. And this diversity of thought, perspectives, and experience has been extremely valuable in the development of our report. And while we all didn't necessarily agree about every issue, the recommendations in this report represent those ideas and actions where the weight of consensus was great enough to move forward with a reasonable degree of confidence that the accomplishment of these recommendations would lead to our overall goal. I remember many discussions in our working groups about the fact that there have been and continue to be a lot of things happening to combat this problem. And this is both good news and bad news. Good news because there are so many good initiatives and best practices we've learned collectively as a community of government, industry, and other organizations. But in some ways, bad news because there are so many initiatives and recommendations out there that it can be maddening to keep pace or see the signal through the noise. So the first point I want to reemphasize is what Philip has already stated, that the Ransomware Task Force report is not meant to belittle any of that good work, but to stand on the shoulders of the best efforts, to consolidate and clarify the best of the best, to make them more easily accessible, to help apply a more coordinated and strategic approach, and to highlight some innovative ideas that we think can make a real difference in reducing the risks associated with ransomware. So I wanted to highlight some of the gaps that we've observed to date in the efforts to combat ransomware and how we hope our report can help fill those gaps. I want to focus on 3 strategic gaps. And the first gap is really about the nature of this threat itself. As stated before, we believe that ransomware has crossed the threshold, no longer only a criminal threat driven by profit motive. It's now impacting national security, economic stability, and even societal health and safety on a massive scale. Wide-scale acknowledgement of this assessment is the first gap we set out to fill. And as you've already seen recently with organizations like DHS and the Justice Department, this is already beginning to change. Make no mistake, our report isn't about eliminating ransomware as a threat. We've taken a very practical approach in seeking to change the trajectory of this threat that has now crossed a very dangerous threshold. We believe that our recommendations can reduce ransomware from its current out-of-control status to a level that can be more effectively managed, like other threats that are dealt with through a comprehensive, practical risk management framework. Doing so will require that we fill some other gaps that exist. And the second gap I'd like to address is the magnitude of the effort required to make a real dent in this problem, as well as the breadth and depth of participating organizations required to achieve the scope and scale required. Although I'm retired Army, I'll borrow a phrase from my naval comrades to say that our report calls for an all-hands-on-deck approach in order to succeed. No single organization, public or private, has all of the capabilities, capacities, skills, experience, resources, or authorities to act effectively in isolation. It takes a team approach across government, industry, academia, nonprofits, and others, and it must be international because this threat knows no boundaries or borders. Secondly, as is usually the case with complex problems, there's no single easy button that's going to solve this problem or even make a significant enough change on its own. While we've called out some of the more impactful recommendations in the report, I would suggest that one of the gaps I'm talking about here that we've seen to date is simply the piecemeal approach that has largely been worked in stovepipes, both organizationally as well as from an operational strategy perspective. I believe that the recommendations in our report should be viewed as an interrelated and mutually reinforcing set of actions that should be applied with continuous, overwhelming pressure in a comprehensive manner to slowly cause real change. The whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. So picking and choosing only a handful of the various recommendations will only weaken the total weight and constant pressure required for real lasting change. And finally, the last gap is about leadership. Certainly not leadership at any one individual organization, because as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of good independent efforts out there dealing with this problem. But I'm talking about leadership from the very top. This effort and our recommendations must be embraced at the very top, where there's both direct and indirect authority across all the agencies and organizations that need to be involved as a policy priority with commensurate resources, or else we won't move the needle. Without that kind of leadership, I expect we'll only continue to nibble around the edges of this growing problem and find ourselves as an international community sooner or later coming to the same conclusion that the RTF has come to right here. If we're going to do this, let's do it right, and now's the time to commit. And at this point, I'll turn it over to my wonderful colleague and co-chair, Megan Stiefel, for her remarks about some of the highlights in our report.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to everyone for joining us this morning if you're on the West Coast. I first want to take a moment to extend my thanks, in particular to Philip Reiner for his leadership on this effort, and to IST, and to the working group co-chairs and task force members for their thoughtful contributions. John has just outlined how existing gaps are contributing to the scale and scope of ransomware. In just a few years, as Secretary Mayorkas has indicated, it's grown from a nuisance to a national security threat, and it's not just a problem for the United States. As the report outlines, organizations around the world have been targeted by ransomware. As has also been well established, these threat actors operate from safe havens, countries whose governments are mostly unwilling as well as unable to support efforts to bring them to justice. Given the size of this threat, reducing its impact in one country is not possible without the assistance of others. Likewise, even if the United States and partner nations reduce ransomware in their own jurisdictions, without significantly limiting this threat, there's little guarantee it won't simply emerge elsewhere, presenting an ongoing risk to the national and global community. As a result, the task force recommends that coordinated international diplomatic and law enforcement efforts make clear that ransomware is an international national security and law enforcement priority. They should do so through a comprehensive resource strategy that uses both carrots and sticks to reduce countries providing safe haven. In doing so, they can build on the G7 2020 finance minister statement and further signaling publicly the urgency of this threat. But countries must also work collaboratively amongst themselves and with the private sector to share information, jointly investigate, and bring these actors to justice, or otherwise eliminate their ability to operate with impunity. The task force's second recommendation is to support this international effort and signal United States leadership in prioritizing ransomware as a national security threat. In doing so, the task force recommends that the United States government establish and resource several collaborative groups. First, we believe that the United States and the White House should lead a working group to drive interagency effort in a common direction. This working group should also work collaboratively with a joint ransomware task force to pool intelligence, enable disruption, and work with the private sector in doing so. Third, we see the need for ransomware threat focus hubs to facilitate and coordinate sustained public-private actions against mutually identified actors. To further signal its commitment to reducing the ransomware threat, including support for victims in doing so, the task force also recommends that governments make cyber response and recovery funds available to support response and other actions. And in addition, require that organizations both consider alternatives prior to making payments, and in the event that they do choose to make payments, that they make information about those payments to government in advance. This reporting will facilitate others' response as well as possible investigative and disruptive measures. As these actions will likely require legislative support, there are still steps that governments can take now. For example, to request that entities that have been targeted by ransomware voluntarily report the details about such incidents. In addition to response and recovery funds, and given the global scope and scale of the ransomware threat, the task force recommends that a framework be developed to help organizations better prepare for and respond to ransomware attacks, together with materials to support framework implementation, such as toolkits and other how-to guidance. In some cases, governments may need to require that organizations in privileged positions adopt better security measures, including measures identified through the development of this ransomware framework. For example, the task force expects that states and managed service providers may need to be required to adopt baseline security measures. To further support framework adoption, the task force also believes that fine relief and funding may also be necessary to incentivize implementation of these recognized best practices. Developing and adopting enhanced cybersecurity practices is one mechanism by which ransomware can be addressed. But disrupting the business model and eliminating payouts is also essential to significantly reducing ransomware. For this reason, the task force recommends that entities involved in cryptocurrencies be more closely regulated. The task force recommends that governments require cryptocurrency exchanges, kiosks, and over-the-counter trading desks comply with existing laws. As noted in the report, according to a recent study, fewer than 200 deposit addresses received 80% of all funds sent by ransomware addresses in 2020. But in almost half of those funds were only sent by 25 addresses. Thus, the task force believes that regulatory measures must be enhanced to form a broader net to collect consistent information from organizations facilitating ransomware payments. Here too, voluntary action can be undertaken immediately. For example, by expanding the detail of ransomware payment indicators shared among victims, response firms, crypto and other currency actors, and law enforcement. Collection and analysis of this information is critical to mapping and targeting the criminal ecosystem. As the task force's 5 priority recommendations reflect, a range of stakeholders must unite to effectively combat ransomware. These recommendations build on existing efforts, which, when implemented together with the additional actions identified in the report, can ensure that future years see fewer ransomware attacks. I'd like to now turn it over to Sarah Pawazek, Program Manager for the Ransomware Task Force, to introduce the framework for ransomware mitigation.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sarah Pawazek, and I'm the Program Manager of the Ransomware Task Force here at IST. It is my pleasure to introduce the ransomware framework, the result of several months of intensive work between over 60 experts across government, industry, and civil society. For a problem as pervasive as ransomware, our solution set needed to aid current mitigation efforts and proactively curb a cybercrime that worsens every day. To this end, we've centered our recommendations around 4 goals that must be accomplished to reduce the ransomware threat now and in the years to come. Our first goal is to deter ransomware attacks through a nationally and internationally coordinated comprehensive strategy. Ransomware can be deterred if conducting an attack becomes risky and more or less likely to succeed, in addition to becoming more costly. This includes holding criminals accountable, promoting international prioritization and collaboration, and eliminating safe havens where criminals operate with impunity. Our second goal is to disrupt the ransomware business model and decrease criminal profits. Ransomware can be disrupted when threat actors are pushed out of the business and the appeal to new threat actors is reduced. This includes increased targeting of the criminals themselves, of their technical infrastructure, and of the cryptocurrency payment process that they rely on for funds. Our third goal is to help organizations prepare for ransomware attacks. Organizations will be better prepared for an attack with clear directives, adequate resources, and the right incentives. This includes providing a single, clear ransomware framework for preparation and response, and incentivizing businesses and governments to increase their cyber hygiene and to defend their networks. Lastly, our fourth goal is to respond to ransomware attacks more effectively. Better information sharing and victim support will improve our collective resilience to ransomware. We recommend greater resources for victims, enhanced reporting mechanisms, and clear guidelines for what to do after a ransomware attack. We recognize that these goals are interdependent. Criminals cannot effectively be deterred without disruption of their activities, and organizations can't prepare or respond to ransomware attacks without an increase in awareness and resources. It is therefore crucial that all four of these goals are enacted in tandem. Together, they form a comprehensive strategy that can dampen the shockwaves of ransomware now and curb this rising trend over the next few years. I want to say thank you to all the Ransomware Task Force members who built onto this framework. The result is deeply informed by technical practitioners. The actions we propose are grounded in operational knowledge and are imminently feasible. With that, I'll hand it back to Philip to introduce our upcoming panel, which will delve deeper into each of these goals and the specific actions we recommend.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to John and Megan, not only for your contributions, but for helping lead this overall effort. We're now going to open the conversation up a little bit. We're going to dig a little deeper into the details of the recommendations that are in the full framework that we've put forward for all of your consideration here today. We're really excited to have a fantastic panel with a number of the co-chairs who helped lead this effort, which the conversation will consist of a moderated discussion up front and then open up for about 15 minutes of your questions and answers so that you can engage with the panel directly. You'll see the opportunity for submitting those questions and answers at the bottom of your video feed. So please feel free to submit those now and as we go through the conversation. Let me welcome the panelists. Michael Phillips, who is the Chief Claims Officer at the cyber insurance firm Resilience. He was one of the three lead co-chairs of the overall task force effort from the very, very beginning, and who co-led a working group that was focused on disruption with Kimball Walden, who is the Assistant General Counsel in Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit. She's a former cybersecurity attorney and advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, where she served for 10 years, and worked with Michael to help lead the disruption working group. Jen Ellis, who is the Vice President of Community and Public Affairs at Rapid7, and just an all-around amazing human being. She helped co-lead the effort with John Davis, focused on prepare and helping organizations be better prepared for ransomware attacks. And then Chris Painter, the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation, the former State Department coordinator for cyber issues and Department of Justice official, who worked with me to help co-lead the deter portions of the framework in that working group. We're pleased for this panel to be joined by Aliza Sabanius from Bloomberg News, who's going to moderate the discussion for us here today. Aliza is someone who comes as a person who writes about the intersection of tech policy and foreign policy as a cyber security reporter based in Washington, D.C. Her work spans nation-state hacking, influence operations on social media, and U.S. strategy in cyberspace. She covered the Trump White House for Bloomberg, focusing on cyber and national security, and is one of the members of the Aspen Strategy Group's Rising Leaders program. Aliza, thank you for joining us here today and for moderating this discussion, and I'll turn things over to you from here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all discussing the topic of ransomware and talking about some of your recommendations for addressing it. In reporting on ransomware, a couple of things have become clear. The volume of attacks are increasing, the sophistication of attackers continues to evolve, and as we heard here today, it is increasingly a security priority for the US. So I'd like to just start the discussion with you, Chris, and I'm hoping you can outline for us the contours of the ransomware threat that you see both from a national and an international perspective. And I'd also like to hear about your thoughts on the kind of diplomatic campaign that might be used to address it.
Well, great, and thank you. It's great to be here, and it was great to be a participant in helping co-chair this really, I think, important effort. I think we need to start thinking of ransomware, and this is just emphasizing what we heard from Secretary Mayorkas and several of our colleagues before. We need to stop thinking of this as just a cybercrime issue or something we don't pay attention to or only pay attention to when there's a headline about it. We need to treat it the way we're beginning to treat nation-state threats. In fact, I think the ransomware threat, for its potential to be incredibly disruptive, and we've seen this on state and local enterprises and governments, we've seen it on the healthcare system, has been said, which was really critical over the last year and going forward. We're seeing it increasingly, not just in the US but around the world. And because of its disruptive nature, because of a lot of the second order damages, we can't just focus on how much ransomware is paid. This costs a huge amount to these companies and these entities to try to put their pieces back together, and it has very wide-ranging effects. We need to treat this as that same level of threat as nation states. And I'm glad to see that we're already beginning to do that. The statements that have come out of the 5-country ministerial that Ali talked about, out of the G7 ministerial, we're getting that traction. And it's not obviously just a US issue. Other countries, there's lots of data talking about a number of other countries around the world have been hit, including everything from the UK to Brazil. And more countries are becoming targets. And that means this is an international problem. The perpetrators are often located in other countries. Even when they're not, they route their attacks through other countries to make it harder to detect them. So we needed a concerted, sustained effort internationally to go after this. Now, when I think about that, and you asked what kind of effort do we need, I break that into several categories. One is signaling. We need to signal this is a priority both domestically and internationally. And those high-level statements and action plans that go with them that come out of things like the G7 or the G20, those are incredibly important. They signal this is important, and they signal both to our populations, but also to our law enforcement and to our companies and other entities that we're taking this seriously, and we're going to dedicate resources to it. So the signaling is part of it. The second is the kind of both policy and operational coordination you need internationally. So there's a lot you'll hear about today, and you've already heard about what we're doing domestically, and that's really important. But we need to really scale that up so that's an international effort. We're working with our partners and allies to do that, to be able to exchange information, be able to get after this threat, to be able to target the most pernicious groups that are involved in this, to try to interrupt essentially disrupt their operations. But that has to be an international effort. And there's certainly great international efforts out there. We see from Europol and others, but we need to build and amplify those. And the third part of this is, the recognition that we're going after these ransomware actors, but we also have to deal with countries who are either turning a blind eye to this or who are, deliberately sheltering these actors. So, there's a carrot and a stick approach here, as Megan said. The stick is for those countries that are either coddling them or in some nation states are involved in this activity. So, and don't seem very willing to help. So for that, I think we have to employ more coercive methods. And we need to do that not just by ourselves, but again, with our allies and partners. Use things like financial sanctions, use other tools that we have in the toolkit, but make it part of our overall relationship with those countries so they actually understand this is a big deal to us, and we're gonna apply consistent pressure, not just in one meeting, but consistent pressure to try to change their behavior and to get at these bad actors where they are. There are a lot of other countries, frankly, though, that they like to help, but they don't prioritize it, and they just don't have the capability. And that's where I like the carrots more than the sticks, even as a former prosecutor. And so what I'd like to do is be able to work with those countries to provide capacity building. That's what the organization I'm helping run now, the GFC, does. Provide capacity building, help them to actually have the ability to do this, but also incentivize them by doing joint operations and other things so that they want to when they prioritize these things. And if we don't have that concerted effort internationally, building on all the other things you'll hear about today, I think we're not going to make the progress we need.
That's a really interesting point you make about the US playing an important role in diplomacy around ransomware. I thought it was interesting that the report also talked about the way that the US government could organize and operate domestically, both within the public sector and the private sector, to address the threat of ransomware. Kamba, I would love your thoughts on how exactly you think the US could effectively do this.
Sure. Thank you for asking that question. I am a gigantic fan of information sharing. I'm a gigantic fan of national strategies. So the US government, I think, can organize around this. And you've heard Secretary Mayorkas talk about DHS's efforts. We've heard in the press recently about DOJ's efforts. Each agency, each component of each agency has different authorities to be able to get after this problem. One of the things that I think we can improve upon is a better coordinated approach, better sharing of information among our law enforcement agencies, and they span across different agencies, executive branch agencies. So you have the FBI and Secret Service, you even have the US Postal Inspector, you have enforcement authorities related to Treasury activity, Ofac, FinCEN. Get all of these agencies together, come up with a coordinated strategy, have that coordinated US government strategy complement a global strategy, right? You heard Secretary Mayorkas and several others talk about the borderless nature of this crime. And so we need a global strategy that the US government can feed into. And then we need to do better about sharing among the government with the private sector and then among the private sector. And so you'll see in our report sort of this three-tiered approach, right? Organizing principles around interagency activity, sharing actionable information, being transparent between the government and the private sector. After all, you've heard in the stats before, the private sector owns something like 80 or 90% of the critical infrastructure, or the infrastructure in which these ransomware actors operate. But the government has a lot of authority and a lot of interest to take action. And so between the private sector's signals and the government's authorities, there are a lot of actions that we can take that will really make an impact on this crime, on the global nature of this crime. And then we also need a framework for having the private sector interact among each other, right? That would include, and you'll see in the report, help from the government in clarifying, for example, what defensive measures are appropriate for this sort of, to take action against this sort of crime among the private sector. The private sector can get together and sort of map out how the criminal element here is using the infrastructure to deploy ransomware at the end. So we have, which is great that this task force was composed of big tech companies and cyber insurance companies, carriers, and the public sector, law enforcement agencies, nonprofits. We were very victim focused. We were organizationally focused. We were internationally focused, and we really were able to put our heads together to figure out the best approaches to reducing the threat of ransomware. And we need to continue to do that on an ongoing process, an ongoing way, and operationalize some of that thinking. So I think having the U.S. government, and this is my final point, sort of take a whole of government approach and influence sort of our whole of civil society approach, focusing resources the way Phil described earlier, focusing our strategy and sort of providing leadership, I think will get us all on sort of the common trajectory to making a dent in this crime.
And in addition to the work of trying to deter ransomware actors, your report also talks about the ways that organizations could be better prepared to respond to the ransomware attacks that occur. So some of the recommendations include mandating the disclosure of ransoms paid, setting aside funds to be ready for ransomware, or requiring that organizations consider alternatives before paying a ransom? Jen, I would love your perspective on what needs to be done on the preparation side to ensure that, because the threat's not going to be fully deterred, there's good recourse once ransomware hits.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for being here and for letting me be here. I mean, I've been sitting here doing my famous nodding dog impression as my co-panelists and co-chairs have been speaking, vehemently agreeing with them. And I think you're going to hear a lot of the same themes coming up over and over again, right? This leadership focus, this government leadership role, the international collaboration, the public-private partnership. And, you know, General Davis, mentioned earlier on about how we have seen this huge body of effort that's happened in the past on ransomware. We came into the task force with that very much in mind. You know, we had this point of view of, it's not a new issue. It's a known issue. There's a lot of work that's gone into it already. There are amazing initiatives like No More Ransom and all sorts of guidances, but we're still seeing people fall victim to ransomware attacks every day. So there's a disconnect between the effort that's happened previously and the ability for organizations to adopt and absorb. And so we were trying to figure out, like, where does that disconnect come from? And I think John used the phrase earlier of like standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. That was what we wanted to do, right? We wanted to think about, like, how do we build on what they've already done and how do we amplify and continue that effort? So how do we figure out where this disconnect is and address it? And I think, you know, what we came down to is if an individual or entity truly understands a threat and truly believes that that threat is relevant to themselves, then they are likely to take whatever mitigation or remediation steps possible to the best of their ability. So the disconnect here comes down to either organizations don't truly understand the threat, or they don't truly believe it's relevant to themselves, or they lack the capacity, the capability, the resources to address it. And actually, I think, like, which of those it is and how they combine together depends on where you sit in the market. You know, if you're looking at the lower end of the market and you're looking at local governments and small to medium businesses, then they probably lack that capability and some of the sort of sophistication or knowledge. At the higher end of the market, they might have the resources, but lack that belief that it's relevant to themselves. So we sort of tried to come up with a point of view on how can you address this and enable people to get the knowledge they need in a way that's going to be replicable, be relevant, and be consistent. So again, this is where those themes come in again, like the international coordination. So what we would love to see on the preparation side to help organizations prepare is for there to be a single comprehensive framework developed through international coordination, developed to break down the steps that need to be taken and make them actually actionable, practical for organizations of all different sizes. So maybe you can have sort of a maturity model, and for then there to be some translation into business leaders, so business leaders understand the relevance to themselves. And so that's sort of the piece around preparation, and that can go all the way through to response. You know, you can have a framework that tackles both sides in the same way that, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework does today. But then the other piece that we looked at is, when you look at ransomware, you're talking about something that is intrinsically at heart profit motivated. So how do you shift the ability for ransomware criminals to generate profit out of it? And the hope is that then they will go and find other sources of revenue. And so there are lots of different levers on that, right? And from a preparation and response point of view, one of the things that we looked at is, how do you shift the calculus for victim organizations thinking about making payments? So a couple of things that you mentioned in asking the question. So number one, requiring payments to be disclosed. And this has a couple of benefits. One, you know, we hope that it'll make people think twice before they make a payment. but it also means that it will enable law enforcement to have a better idea of what's happening and be able to sort of, build a corpus of work, right? Again, and share information out to the community that helps people understand what's happening. Doing that, though, while anonymizing the data so that organizations are not sort of being re-victimized. So that's one. The second is looking at asking organizations to do a cost-benefit analysis before they decide to pay, so that they can really kind of get into understanding, is this the right approach for us? Is there a better way? Is paying going to really be the right solution for us? And then the third, which you mentioned again, is having governments potentially create a fund that would create this safety net, particularly for organizations that are in the critical or essential category. A lot of organizations that are in that category, they really struggle when they get hit by ransomware, and they have enormous pressure on them to continue to deliver the service and have no disruption to it. And so payment seems like the only option for them. And having governments take like a stronger role and provide a better safety net for them, both through financial aid and also, through expertise and that kind of thing, I think it does help shift that calculus a little bit. So that's the piece around payments on the preparation and response side. And then I think there's more that my colleagues can talk to here on the other side, the deterrence and disruption sides.
Thank you. And just before we get to the deterrence and disruption side, I think that one interesting piece of how organizations can prepare has to do with cyber insurance. And Michael, given your background, I'd be curious for your thoughts on the role that cyber insurance plays in this ecosystem and what can be done to improve the landscape that insurers and victims are currently operating in.
Well, thank you for your question. And the best insurance always does two things. First, of course, it helps an individual organization recover from an incident. And so for cyber insurance, that has included thousands and thousands of ransomware victims, getting them back up and running. But the best insurance in any line of business, whether it's cyber or otherwise, also does a second thing. And that is it promotes best practices, incentivizes the right types of preventative measures and risk management solutions that can bend the curve of whatever the problem is, whether it's building a house on a floodplain or here, ransomware, dealing with the ransomware epidemic. So the framework's recommendations with respect to cyber insurance are designed to continue to accelerate cyber insurance's trend line towards providing better preparation for firms that may need it. Also to help identify, set the standards for cybersecurity that a firm may need to prevent a ransomware attack from becoming successful or destructive. And also to incentivize further better behavior. One thing about cyber insurance is that for the last 20, 30 years, it has been the data nexus and the nexus for the victim's experience with respect to the ransomware crisis. And so the framework's recommendations highlight the opportunity for cyber insurers to partner better in the spirit of public partnership, public and private partnerships that all of my distinguished co-leaders have presented upon to enhance government action, to enhance private sector action, and to pursue the bad guys. So I suppose my pivoting point here is that the insurance sector has paid hundreds of millions of dollars in ransomware losses. And who better to be angry about it than the insurers who have paid those losses? So one of the recommendations that we have put forward is, of course, a consortium of insurers and reinsurers who should be collaborating, sharing information with government experts, with law enforcement, but also figuring out those security standards, which can be hard to identify in one industry versus the next, one type of industry versus the next or organization. But also to pursue subrogation, which just means the victim's rights, pursuing the victim's rights writ large by going after the actors. It's been an honor to work with Kemba on some of the disrupt ideas that we've been putting forward. And those are really designed to do three things. One, disrupt the payments process and the profitability of ransomware for the criminals, disrupt their technical infrastructure, and third, disrupt them themselves. And for the insurance sector, pursuing subrogation is an opportunity for us to do all of those things if we do it the right way and in conjunction with our partners. One thing that I want to tee up for my colleagues is our attention to cryptocurrency. it's very important for us that we not thwart all of the good blockchain innovation that's out there. And so we put together some recommendations with respect to cryptocurrency, which is the unfortunate lifeblood of ransomware crime, to try and disrupt and make less profitable the ransomware epidemic.
And building off of that, Kemba, could you talk to us about why cryptocurrency is the lifeblood of ransomware, your thoughts on regulating it, and how this ecosystem could be made better?
Sure, and thank you for my co-chair, Michael, for bringing up the sort of our three-tiered approach to disruption infrastructure, payment systems, and the threat actor himself or herself. But with respect to payment distribution, we have found that ransomware actors like to function in the decentralized, pseudonymous nature of blockchain technology, right? So they like to work in Bitcoin. In particular, Bitcoin is a bit more liquid than some of the other cryptocurrencies. I was shocked, for one, to learn that these ransomware criminals like to use Bitcoin as opposed to using, by and large, privacy coins, for example. These are even though they're pseudonymous and they're designed to protect privacy, they are traceable payments. And so we figure there must be a way to reduce profitability, making it difficult for them to retain profit through Bitcoin and then transfer that profit or convert that money into fiat. There must be a better way to do that. And then we also were concerned about making it more difficult to enter the ransomware sort of business model in the first place. So that's one of the reasons why we focused on cryptocurrency here. We found in collaborating with a lot of the crypto exchanges and on and off ramps that they don't want illicit activity on their platforms just as much as we don't want illicit activity, them to profit. So there are ways that we can collaborate better with the on and off ramps to make sure that we know our customers or that they know their customers, we know the transaction, we're able to trace those transactions and lead to an effective disruption. I think there was a case that DOJ published just yesterday where they were able to do some of that forensic analysis with another member of the ransomware task force chain analysis to bring down what they termed as a kingpin, right, in this mixer business. So when a criminal actor uses Bitcoin, one of the things that they'll do is obfuscate the funds to try to make it a little bit more difficult to trace and to seize. And they've been able to effectively take down what they term as a kingpin in this economy, this illicit economy. But right, just like Michael described, the task force is we're made up of somewhat of some tech companies and innovators ourselves. We are excited about the innovation of blockchain technology. We just want it to be used for good, right? And ransomware right now is one of those areas where it's being used for illicit, nefarious purposes. So I think it's inevitable that heightened regulation is going to get us at least one step further. I'm encouraged by what I see coming out of the Hill with the SEC and CFTC looking further into investor protections, for example. I'm jazzed about certain cryptocurrency exchanges becoming publicly traded companies and therefore subjecting themselves to further regulatory scrutiny. I think all of these efforts, this collaborative, cooperative effort to sort of make these illicit uses a little bit more difficult, I think will get us quite a far way in disrupting the payment systems that support ransomware.
Thank you. And before I ask my next question, I just wanted to remind everybody that you can send in some questions. I'll be turning to the audience soon. I see a couple coming in, and I'd love to ask your questions, so please keep sending them. My next question is for Jen. First of all, feel free to build on your thoughts about the cryptocurrency issue, but I'm also curious about your thoughts on an international perspective on this report. Obviously, this report is focused primarily on the US, talking about sort of what we can do domestically tactically, diplomatically, but I understand from you that this report is also meant for a broader international audience. So how should people outside of the US be thinking about applying some of these recommendations, and which ones are most important?
Yeah, I definitely had some times in this whole thing where I felt like I was the token international with my British accent turning up and being like, don't forget the rest of the world. And I think, I mean, I don't think it's a case of like carving out pieces and saying this is relevant to the rest of the world and this isn't. I think, to be fair, all of it's relevant. You know, as we've said a number of times now, ransomware is an international issue. The internet and the digital economy are international, they are global. And so, you know, when we came up with recommendations, yes, the specific examples we used were often oriented or tied around US systems or US processes or US agencies, because that's where a lot of our prior expertise and comfort came from. But most governments have equivalents. And so I think that the recommendation sets are relevant and can be used. I mean, as an example, you know, Kemba talked earlier on about what this would look like in the US with a whole of government approach and then public-private partnership. Well, I mean, you know, that can be applied to any government, right? And I, you know, I have a bias because I'm British, but I think NCSC in the UK has, you know, quite famously done a lot of work through public-private partnership, and other governments have as well. So I would say every government will look at it, and they will look at what they think is going to work within their own jurisdiction and legislative frameworks, and what makes sense for them. But the key here is not just for every government to take that and look at it that way for themselves. It's also to talk to each other about it and work together. It's that alignment and that coordination that's going to make the really, really big difference.
It's an interesting point you make about moving from the report itself and its recommendations to actually implementing this. And I'd love to talk to you guys about sort of how you move from these recommendations, which you've thought hard about, to trying to implement them both in the government and in the private sector. So perhaps, Chris, if you could talk to us about your thoughts on implementing some of the government and diplomatic recommendations in this report. And Michael, I would love your thoughts on sort of the private sector element of that question.
So this report is just in spring, you know, out of whole cloth. We've been working on this for several months, and in the course of working on it, we've been talking to various actors in our government and other governments about this, and that's got to continue. You know, I think we've all seen very well-intentioned, very good reports that end up becoming shelfware, and we can't afford that to happen here. We need to make this actionable. Now, I think what's already started to happen is exactly what we need. You know, when we see actions from DOJ, we see actions from DHS. Mayorkas talked about something maybe forthcoming from the White House. That's exactly what we want. And that, you know, if this could be a roadmap to those actors, I don't expect them to follow every recommendation to the jot and tittle that we have. But if this can be an inspiration for them to act and to work and to take advantage of really the hard work that was put in by all of us, which was really an exceptional, as others have stated, kind of multi-stakeholder group from lots of different angles, that would be great. And so we need to move out on this. We can't just study the problem. We can't admire the problem. This has to be something we go forward with. And that's true internationally. And, you know, one thing is, you know, to build on what Jen says, absolutely. I think we have to get other governments to pay attention to this. I think they already are, because they're certainly victims. But you also need governments to be the moving entities. When we talk about putting out something in the G20, for instance, some government has to push that. You know, it doesn't happen automatically. So that could be the US, it could be the UK, it could be some other government. Great. I think we welcome that. We're not particularly that has to be the US to be the one pushing it. We want the US to be one of the ones pushing it, certainly. And when we try to build coalitions against countries that are providing a safe haven, whether they're doing it because they don't have the capabilities or not, again, someone has to take the lead on that. And I think the US has started to do that already in terms of some of the state actions, but I think, you know, that has to happen too. And then, you know, I'd like to see this raised at high-level diplomatic engagements. You know, if, for instance, there is a summit between Putin and Biden, has been suggested on a number of issues, this should be raised. This is a problem. We see actors in Russia. So those are some of the ways I'd see it implemented. Michael, over to you.
Oh, well, thanks, Chris. Briefly, what we've experienced in our 4-month sprint, meetings almost every day, is that no one should be walking alone on this, and change is possible if we're all working together. So, from the point of view of a modest cyber insurance man, obviously I've got competitors every day who hate my guts. But on this problem, the energy is here for coordinated action. And so the feedback that we've received has been extraordinary. And together with law enforcement and with other industry sectors, I think we can maximize our ability to impact this problem. And so, I know insurance is one hot sector for the topic. We study it. We've invested our capital in trying to resolve this problem. But there are other sectors too. And I know Kemba's got view on it, if I may.
Sure, you may, Michael. So at the top of this session, you mentioned that I launched and lead our ransomware effort at Microsoft. What's become clear to me in that effort, but also in co-chairing the Disrupt Group, is that there is a role for everybody. And on the private sector side, that's big tech, that's incident response, that's threat intelligence, that's cyber insurance, there are nonprofits, carriers. There is a role for everyone. So if I think to implement this framework, if each private sector entity, organization, civil society participant can take a look at it and figure out where they add value the best, and then come together and collaborate and operationalize some of our activities, some of our ideas, work together with the government and our counterparts in the government, I think we will move quite a far distance in this space. But I do agree that there is a role for every member of the private sector.
Thank you. And now I'd like to open this to questions from the audience. I'm seeing some good ones here. So to start, I'd love to ask our panelists who have some background in the US government to talk about the role that the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which is run through the FBI, should play in your conception of combating ransomware.
So maybe I'll start, because at one point I worked in that area at DOJ. So look, I think they have a role to play. I think they are meant to be a task force that goes after various criminal activity and even some nation state activity. They have threat focus cells that look at these issues to try to bring different aspects together. So we didn't prescribe any one entity to take that forward, because we think the federal government can figure that out among themselves, frankly. But certainly the NCIJTF falls trippingly off your tongue. The NCIJTF does provide, I think, some really good capabilities and focus. And I suspect that what came out of Justice recently, talking about the Justice Department really setting up an internal task force with the FBI, with the other parts of the Justice Department, that'll be a key part of that.
Thank you. And another question coming in here is, what are the benefits for the US government on mandating that organizations report ransomware payments if they don't have all the cyber threat intelligence that the private sector has? Wouldn't a shared fusion center be more beneficial?
I can try to take that one on, and hope my co-panelists can weigh in as well. One of the benefits of mandatory reporting is really that actionable information sharing that we talked about a little bit earlier. The security community functions best when we have good data. The people that hold the best data in this circumstance are the victims themselves. It is difficult to sort of shoot in the dark, and that's probably a horrible word to use, but it's difficult to sort of maneuver in the dark and figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it without clear, actionable information. And that doesn't mean that we want, as a security community, to re-victimize the victim. It doesn't even mean that we necessarily, although sometimes it could be helpful, but necessarily even to know who the victim is. But we are very clear in the report that the type of information that would be helpful from the victim are, from my perspective, and payment disruption in particular, the hashes that are associated with the ransom notes, the Bitcoin wallets. So the ransom note itself, the victim actually has a lot of information, a lot of indicators that companies like ours and others, Mandian and others, can write signatures against, and really get after the problem, really focus our energy and efforts. And that's really from a disruption and deterrence perspective, really one of the impetuses behind gathering that information. So yes, the private sector has a lot of information, but in this context, the victims themselves have the best information.
And I might add, it's understandable that some victims don't want to report this. They don't want to be embarrassed by it. They don't want it to undermine, their customers' confidence. But we've seen this in other areas too, like data breaches, where there are laws in all 50 states that require that. We've seen more and more of those things come forward. And I think what we've seen is that when companies don't report this kind of information, or other victims don't report this kind of information, you're actually helping the criminals more than you're helping yourself, because two things might happen. One, it might get public later on anyway, and then you look like you weren't doing enough to try to prevent it, or those criminals can come back or bring their friends and go after you again. So there's an incentive. We need to have incentives for folks to do this, but I think it's an important step in us getting a handle on the problem.
Thank you. And we have another interesting question here, which is, how can private sector organizations ensure that they are complying with Ofac requirements when considering ransom payments? What should they include in their decision-making process, which usually comes under extreme time pressure?
So my guess is my co-panelists would like me to start this one. So, certainly compliance with the Ofac advisories and the FinCEN advisory as well is of the utmost importance for every financial institution and for victims too. And in the cyber insurance space, we require that happen as part of anything if God forbid a ransom must be paid. The challenge comes when threat research experts, government intelligence experts, the ransomware resolution experts disagree about attribution. So, we do highlight in our framework the need for greater clarity so that victims who are in a point of crisis have as much clarity as possible. Of course, at the same time, we want to make sure that they have meaningful choices not to pay ransom. But as long as that choice must exist, we want there to be clarity around the government's intention to sanction certain actors, which of course is of the utmost importance.
Thank you. And another question here talks about the different efforts to combat ransomware and concern that there'll be redundancy. How do you guys think about that and make sure that the efforts are synced up?
I can jump in here, I think. It definitely was a concern that I had in joining the task force was I didn't really want to rehash stuff that's already been done. And I think everybody, there were more than 50 people that participated. All of those people were really busy people. They didn't dedicate their time to something like this with the view of just like wanting to put their name on something. They did it because, we haven't made the progress we need to. We haven't gone far enough. And I think our point of view is, again, we try to be really mindful of what already existed. To the extent that where possible, we try to invite people who had created or were participating in efforts to participate in this one as well. I mentioned No More Ransom earlier, which is a great initiative. We invited them to participate as an example, so that we could make sure that we were learning from their expertise and their experiences. And again, boosting their amazing content and tools up rather than just sort of rehashing and creating a lot of redundancy. And I also think that, in reality, while we've tried to take a very holistic approach and look at this from all different sides and come up with a very full set of recommendations, I don't think any of us are naive enough to believe that it's going to be done, right? It's going to be click and everything's solved. So I think the view is that this is an ongoing evolutionary process. We learn from each other's expertise and experiences on this. Others that come after us, and we hope more will come, will learn from what we've done here and hopefully leverage it and take it forward. So I think, the key here is, again, that piece around collaboration and being very mindful of what exists and working together to, really make the most of each other's knowledge in this area.
Yeah, I'd say we specifically pointed to a number of those efforts that are out there. And I think we also recognize that, especially if you're a victim, you don't even know the resources that are available to you. I mean, this is what Jen was talking about earlier, building this kind of framework so people have access, and can plan ahead, which isn't happening now. So that's important. And I think the other thing we all have to recognize is this is not going to be easy. Some of the things I've talked about, we've been dealing with for a number of years, and some of the other panelists too. This is going to take a sustained effort. This is not just we issue a report and we're done, or a year from now we're done. This is going to take a sustained long-term effort. And there's going to be a lot of chances to leverage other efforts, and we want to do that. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to leverage what's there and make it stronger.
Yeah, just to expand slightly on what Chris just said. I think Kemba mentioned that we talked to a lot of victim organizations, and we talked to a lot of end user organizations, and we really tried to get at why the body of work that exists wasn't getting them where they needed to be. And what we heard is that actually part of the problem is the level of noise. And so some of our recommendations are designed to try and reduce or streamline that noise, because exactly as Chris just said, a lot of organizations don't know where to turn. They don't know which source of truth is the most relevant or applicable to them. They look at a lot of the guidances that are out there and they feel that they're either far too simplified or far too complicated. They don't know how to apply them to their own organization. So again, we want to bring those voices together, leverage the great knowledge that's out there and the experience, but try to come up with solutions that fit better, that serve the purposes better for the end user organizations.
Thank you. One of our questioners points out that while there are some countries that seem likely to be interested in doing diplomacy of this kind, there are others like Russia that may not. How do you approach that problem and move the needle there?
Yeah, look, it's a tough nut to crack. This is what I was saying before. These are not going to be easy issues. We've had, I've been doing cyber stuff now for 30 years, which is ridiculous, and have dealt with a lot of these issues when I was at DOJ. With respect to countries who were not very helpful, and Russia, I think, has had a number of issues. I think we have not done a good job, frankly, in using our tools to try to bring these countries around. And it means not just treating this as a cyber issue. It means treating this as a much broader issue, something that affects our overall relationship with the country, and using every leverage point we have. Either this is a priority or it's not. And I think we all have said strongly, this should be a priority. This is a priority. And if it is, raise it in other areas. Use other tools you might have around visas maybe, or financial markets. Use everything you have and work with partners to do that. And if you don't get action, then I think we need to take other measures as well. So that's for the countries that are more intractable. But like I said, it's going to be a sustained effort. It's not something where it's going to change overnight.
And here's an interesting question that we got via social media. What can cryptocurrency companies do to help stop ransomware? Besides know your customer, what else should they be doing?
So I can take that one start, and if other panelists have some ideas too. So one of the things that we discovered in our research is that, like I said earlier, exchanges and other parts of the crypto economy are just as eager to make sure that this platform is not used for nefarious purposes. So one of the things that they can do is do a lot better with filing suspicious activity reports. And I think we talk about that in our recommendation, so that law enforcement has access to better information to be able to take lawful action in seizing wallets, for example. Perhaps doing better about filing 314B reports. And those are the reports that are shared among financial services businesses under Treasury's regulations. That will allow every element of this payment system to be able to identify and root out bad actors or bad activity on the platform if we don't know the actual actor. So there are lots of things. There just needs to be a better collaboration among elements and stakeholders in this crypto economy. Right now, they are innovating, they're developing, and it's fantastic. But better collaboration, I think, it would improve the system overall.
Thank you. Another one of our viewers points out that some of these groups that are doing ransomware attacks use as part of their advertising the ransoms that they've received. So in your view, why does mandatory disclosure make sense? Couldn't it help those groups, in their advertising efforts?
So I can start off, and I'm sure Michael and others have things to say. So the idea of mandatory disclosure, it's more refined than just disclosing that you've been hit, right? Which is what the ransomware actor is doing. It's providing those indicators that help lead to disruption, for example. So the ransomware note itself, the hashes that are in the note, the language, anything that directs you to a top-level domain. And then this is getting very technical, right? But at a broader level, it's the type of information that is helpful, not necessarily only the fact that a victim has been hit. And I think we've even acknowledged in the report the idea of providing protections to victims if they do disclose information, the types of protections that exist in other laws, right? CISA 2015, for example. So this is like I said, there's every part of society has a role here, and victims equally have a role here.
Can I just add very quickly? Sorry, I think that we've got like a little bit of a maybe a lack of clarity on what we're talking about. We're talking about victim organizations reporting directly to a receiving entity that is set up for that purpose. That's a private disclosure. That receiving entity will then gather that information, funnel it to the appropriate law enforcement, and then release sort of aggregated, anonymized information out to the security community. That's a very different thing to a ransomware attacker being like, look how successful I am. And so we're not looking at public disclosure is the first thing that's really important to note. It will be handled very sensitively by an organization that's specifically designed for that purpose. And then the information will be taken and used in ways that will help create sort of, a further body of knowledge to help us combat ransomware. I think the other piece is that there's a factor, there's a process here for organizations as soon as they understand that they have to disclose something that just makes them take a second and think, is this the right thing to do? And that's kind of what we want to do. We're not saying, hey, you can't make a payment. We're just saying, think about it, take a beat, consider what you're looking at doing here. And so that is a factor that comes into this as well.
Thank you very much. On that note, I'd like to tell you I appreciated you doing this panel, everyone who sent in questions, really interesting. I hope we can continue this discussion at some future point, and I'm going to turn this over to Phil.
Thank you, Eliza, and thank you to all of our co-chairs who have really actually been the ones who have helped make this come together and make it really the powerful framework that we think that it can be. I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Daniel now, the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and the former cybersecurity coordinator for President Obama. And Michael's going to share with us here some closing comments and some thoughts to kind of wrap us up, and then I'll come back for just a couple words at the very end. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks to all of my co-chairs for their hard work and for the presentations that they've done today. Thanks to all the task force members who contributed an enormous amount of time and effort. When we talked, this was like sprinting a marathon. So it was an enormous amount of work spread over several months, but I think the results are very much worth it. When you look at this report, it's really an impressive piece of work. And I think everybody that's been involved has really put their best into it. But for me, I think in sort of wrapping this up, I get to paraphrase George Washington in the musical Hamilton. Recommending is easy, implementing is harder. Now we've actually got to turn to the hard part of actually making all of these recommendations work. And it's very heartening to me to see the kind of action we're already seeing in the US government, for example, the sprint that DHS has announced, the task force that DOJ has announced, the EOs and other things, the executive orders that are coming out of the National Security Council. And we need to take all of that to the next level. So what I want to leave us with is the call for action. How do we actually go about thinking about the implementation of the 48 different recommendations in this report? Well, the first thing that I would note is that one of the things you will see when you go through and read this report in detail is that most of the recommendations are not, in fact, technical recommendations. It's not go out and buy this piece of hardware or implement this security control. And that's not to say that those things are not important. They are. But where the real hard, heavy lifting needs to occur is in the legal, the economic, the diplomatic tools that we need to bring to bear on this problem. And so that's why the organizational challenges that the government has to meet up with the private sector. So that's why our report focuses on those aspects of the problem, because that's where the real heavy lifting and the real innovation must take place. Yes, we need people to implement the technical controls, and that's what that ransomware framework that you heard Jen Ellis mention, it will talk about that. But that's why our report really focused up much at a higher level. The second piece is that, as Chris and Jen and the others were all talking about during that panel, and particularly, we need to apply this globally. The United States will not be able to tackle this problem by itself. The cryptocurrency markets themselves are inherently global. For example, the financial system is inherently global. So we're going to have to do this at the international level. And what I would say to our international colleagues is help us translate these recommendations into what works in your political context. One of the reasons that we focused on the US is because that's where most of the people on the task force, that's the government that we knew best. But we recognize that other governments need to implement many of these recommendations as well, but we want to get help making sure that it's phrased and framed and put into the right context for those kinds of governments. We also need to take the long-term view. We did not get into this situation overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight either. So when you look at the recommendations in this report, yes, we need to get started on it now, but these will take time to put into place, and it will take time for them to begin even having effects. And that's not great, but it's the reality that we're in, and that we need to really have that long-term view to make sure that we have got keep our eyes on the prize, which is reducing the threat that ransomware poses to our national security, our public health and safety, and to our economic prosperity down the road. We have to get out of this catastrophic situation that we're facing. Similarly, just because, as I said, that we're taking the long-term view, we also have to sustain it. As I mentioned, these things will take time to implement, and they will require sustained attention and prioritization, not just within the government, but within companies, within nonprofits, within civil society, within academia, all the different parts of the ecosystem that have to work on this problem. We are going to have to sustain our efforts against these and not get against ransomware, and not get distracted by the latest shiny, bright shiny object that comes along. And finally, I would say that we need to be holistic, but don't wait. These recommendations are all linked, yes, but they're not necessarily so tightly coupled that you can't start on some without some of the others. So what I would say is, if you see that you can take a leadership role in implementing some of the recommendations in the report, take it and run with it. We have to get moving on this. And yes, we think that you need to implement the totality of the report in order to have the impact that we want. But that doesn't mean that some of these recommendations wouldn't have benefit implemented on their own. So, and don't wait for yes, we need governments to take the lead, but don't wait on the governments to get moving. If you can get moving faster, you should do that. I would just close this by saying we don't have to accept ransomware as a cost of doing business online. No, we're never going to get rid of all cyber criminal activity. We're not going to get rid of ransomware entirely, any more than we've gotten rid of criminal activity in the physical world. But we don't have to just live in a world where paying off these ransoms is just the price that every business on the internet has to pay for being in business. That's an unacceptable world to live in. We think that that is not the place that we want to be, that we want to have a different world. And we think that based on the work that we have done, these recommendations will indeed make that difference. And we can change the trajectory change our circumstances. And I am actually optimistic that we can do this. We can actually implement these recommendations. They are hard and it will take work, but they are eminently doable recommendations. And so that's the thought that I want to leave us with, and I will turn it back over to Phil to close us out.
Thank you, Michael. I couldn't agree with you more on all the points that you just made. And I will close things out here today by saying an immense thank you to all of the members of the task force who gave us so much of your time, your energy, and your effort. Again, a huge thank you to everybody who's out there who's already trying to work on this problem. We hope that this is, going to contribute to the efforts that you're undertaking. We will continue to push these ideas forward. We will continue to work with everyone in the community to do everything we can to give them the tools that they need. It has really been an impressive group of folks that we've worked with. I also want to say an extra special thank you to all of the co-chairs who you've heard from today. An enormous amount of time, energy, and effort that they gave to us above and beyond their day jobs. They really did give a considerable amount of their time. And so thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who are out there who are unnamed, who contributed to this. You know who you are. Thank you for making this happen. And thank you, huge thanks to Dave and the whole crew at Strange Brew Strategies and John and Amy at the Glen Echo Group. We always have to thank those who support us. Thank you to everybody out there. We look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. This is an incredibly tough set of issues. We know it's going to take time, but as Michael said, we've got to get after it. We've got to get after it collectively. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we look forward to staying in touch with you on this issue.